The year was 1570. In the frozen depths of a Moscow dungeon, a man's screams echoed through stone corridors as molten metal was poured down his throat. His crime, simply being suspected of treason by the most paranoid ruler in Russian history. This wasn't just any execution, this was the handiwork of Ivan IV. Known to history as Ivan the Terrible, a Tsar whose name still sends chills down the spine of anyone who dares to speak it. But how does a child destined for greatness transform into a monster capable of murdering his own son in a fit of rage? How does a brilliant ruler who expanded Russia's borders and strengthened its power simultaneously become the architect of his nation's darkest chapter? Today we're diving deep into the twisted mind of Ivan the Terrible, a story of power, paranoia, and absolute corruption that will leave you questioning whether some people are born evil, or if power itself is the ultimate destroyer of the human soul. If you're fascinated by the dark corners of history and want to uncover more shocking stories from the past, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Picture this: Moscow, 1530. In the grand halls of the Kremlin, a child is born who will one day hold the power of life and death over millions. But Ivan Vasilovich, later known as Ivan IV, didn't enter this world destined for madness. In fact, his early years suggested quite the opposite. His father, Vasily III, was a respected ruler who had successfully expanded Russian territory. His mother, Alina Glinskaya, was a Lithuanian princess known for her intelligence and political acumen. Young Ivan was heir to the largest nation on earth, a vast empire stretching from the Arctic Ocean to the Black Sea. But fate had other plans. When Ivan was just 3 years old, his father died suddenly under mysterious circumstances. Some whispered of poison. Others blamed the stress of ruling such an enormous realm. Regardless of the cause, little Ivan was now Grand Prince of Moscow, though his mother would serve as regent until he came of age. Alina proved to be a capable ruler, but the Russian nobility, the Bojars, were not pleased with a woman holding power. They schemed, they plotted, and they waited for their opportunity. That opportunity came in 1538, when Alina died suddenly at the age of 30. Again, poison was suspected, though never proven. 8-year-old Ivan was now truly alone at the top of the Russian hierarchy, surrounded by ambitious nobles who saw him not as their rightful ruler, but as an obstacle to their own power. What happened next would shape the most brutal reign in Russian history. The boyards treated young Ivan with barely concealed contempt. They ignored his presence in meetings, made decisions without consulting him, and openly mocked the idea that a child could rule Russia. But perhaps most damaging of all, they allowed Ivan to witness their cruelty firsthand. In the Kremlin's halls, Ivan watched as the Bojars tortured and executed those who opposed them. He saw prisoners beaten until their bones broke. He witnessed public executions where victims were drawn and quartered, their screams echoing through Red Square. And slowly, methodically, these images burned themselves into the young prince's developing mind. But the boyars made a critical mistake. They assumed that because Ivan was young, he was powerless. They failed to recognize the cold intelligence burning behind his eyes, or the way he catalogued every slight, every humiliation, every drop of blood spilled in his name. Ivan was learning, and he was planning. By age 13, Ivan had seen enough. The Bojar Prince Andrei Shawsky had been particularly dismissive of the young ruler, treating him like a common child rather than the Grand Prince of Moscow. On December 29, 1543, Ivan made his first move. He ordered his guards to arrest Prince Shawsky. But this wasn't just an arrest, it was a message. Ivan commanded that Shawsky be thrown to a pack of hunting dogs, who tore the man apart while he screamed for mercy. The message was received loud and clear. The child ruler had fangs. January 16, 1547. In the golden splendor of the Cathedral of the Dormition, 16-year-old Ivan knelt before the Metropolitan of Moscow, as the crown of Monomac was placed upon his head. But this wasn't just any coronation. Ivan had insisted on a new title that would strike fear into the hearts of his enemies and subjects alike. He would not merely be Grand Prince, he would be Tsar, a title derived from Caesar, claiming direct lineage to the Roman emperors themselves. Ivan IV was now Ivan I, Tsar of all Russia, and his reign of terror was about to begin in earnest. The early years of Ivan's rule showed promise that perhaps the traumatized child might become a great leader. He implemented legal reforms, expanded trade, and even established diplomatic relations with England. He married Anastasia Romanovna, a woman whose gentle influence seemed to calm his more violent tendencies. For 13 years, it appeared that love had tamed the beast within Ivan. He was a devoted husband, a caring father, and a ruler who genuinely seemed to care for his people's welfare. Historians would later call this his good period, a time when Ivan's intelligence and political acumen shone without the shadow of his cruelty. But in 1560, everything changed. Anastasia fell ill with what modern historians believe was poison. As she lay dying, she whispered to Ivan that the boyars had murdered her. that they could not bear to see him happy and stable. Whether this was true or the paranoid delusion of a dying woman, Ivan believed every word. When Anastasia died, the last vestige of Ivan's humanity died with her. The transformation was immediate and terrifying. The man who had once shown mercy became a creature of pure vengeance. Ivan's paranoia, always simmering beneath the surface, now boiled over into homicidal rage. He began to see enemies everywhere. A bojar who arrived late to court was plotting against him. A merchant who looked at him wrong was a spy. A priest who stumbled over words during service was surely in league with foreign powers seeking to destroy Russia. But Ivan's madness had a terrible intelligence to it. He didn't just lash out randomly, he planned, he calculated, he orchestrated fear itself as a weapon of governance. In 1565, Ivan implemented the Oprachina, perhaps the most brutal internal security system in human history. He divided Russia into two parts: the Zemshina, governed by the Bojars under his watchful eye, and the Oprachina, under his direct control. The Oprachniks Ivan's personal army were dressed in black and rode black horses. They carried dog heads attached to their saddles as a symbol that they would sniff out treason like hounds, and brooms to symbolize their role in sweeping away Ivan's enemies. But these weren't just symbols, they were promises. The Oprachniks had unlimited authority to arrest, torture, and execute anyone Ivan deemed a threat. And Ivan's definition of threat was disturbingly broad. A boyar named Prince Boris Tulupa was suspected of disloyalty. Ivan had him impaled on a stake and left to die slowly over the course of 15 hours. While Ivan sat nearby, calmly eating dinner and occasionally commenting on the man's agonized screams. Another nobleman, Prince Mikhail Vorotinsky, was roasted alive over a slow fire for allegedly practicing witchcraft against the Tsar. His crime, suffering from gout, which Ivan decided was obviously the result of a curse. But perhaps most chilling of all was Ivan's treatment of the merchant class. He became convinced that wealthy merchants were funding plots against him, so he ordered mass executions in Moscow's markets. Entire families were dragged from their homes and butchered in the streets, their only crime being successful in business. By 1570, Ivan's paranoia had reached such heights that he became convinced an entire city was plotting against him. Novgorod, one of Russia's oldest and most prosperous cities, had allegedly sent a letter to the Polish king offering to surrender to foreign rule rather than endure Ivan's tyranny. The letter was almost certainly a forgery, possibly created by Ivan's own agents to justify what came next. But Ivan didn't care about proof, he cared about making an example that would be remembered for centuries. In January 1570, Ivan arrived at Novgorod with an army of Oprachniks. What followed was 6 weeks of systematic slaughter that shocked even Ivan's hardened contemporaries. The Tsar ordered that a wooden wall be built around the entire city so that no one could escape. Then, methodically, brutally, he set about destroying not just the people of Novgorod but the very idea that anyone could oppose him and live. Ivan started with the clergy. Priests were stripped naked and beaten with sticks until their bones broke, then thrown into the freezing Volkhov River. The archbishop was sewn into a bearskin and then hunted by dogs for Ivan's entertainment. Next came the nobles. They were tortured with ingenious cruelties. Some were roasted alive, others had their skin flayed strip by strip while they remained conscious. Ivan personally supervised many of these executions, often suggesting improvements to the torture methods. But Ivan saved his most systematic brutality for the common people. Entire families were brought before him, and he would force parents to watch as their children were tortured to death, then reverse the process. He ordered mass drownings in the Volkhov River, with hundreds of people thrown into the icy water every day. The exact death toll at Novgorod remains disputed, but conservative estimates suggest that at least 15,000 people died during those 6 weeks. Some historians believe the number was much higher, possibly as many as 60,000 in a city that had only 30,000 residents before Ivan arrived. When Ivan finally left Novgorod, it was a city of ghosts. The streets were literally paved with corpses, and the Volkhov River ran red with blood for miles downstream. After Novgorod, Ivan's behavior became even more erratic and violent. He began to see treachery in the smallest actions and respond with disproportionate brutality. When Ivan suspected that Moscow's gate guards were taking bribes, he didn't simply dismiss them or impose fines. Instead, he had them buried alive up to their necks, then rode his horse over their heads, crushing their skulls one by one. A group of foreign ambassadors from the Holy Roman Empire made the mistake of refusing to remove their hats in Ivan's presence, citing diplomatic protocol. Ivan had their hats nailed to their heads with iron spikes, then sent them back to their emperor as a diplomatic message. But perhaps most disturbing was Ivan's treatment of his own family. He married 7 times after Anastasia's death, and several of his wives died under mysterious circumstances. When his second wife, Maria Temryukovna, failed to produce a male heir quickly enough for Ivan's liking, she conveniently died of illness, though many suspected poison. Ivan's relationship with his sons was equally troubled. His eldest son, Ivan Ivanovich, was groomed from childhood to be his successor, but also subjected to his father's paranoid scrutiny. The young prince lived in constant fear of triggering his father's rage, walking on eggshells in his own home. Ivan's paranoia extended to foreign threats as well. He became convinced that Western European powers were plotting to invade Russia, leading him to launch the disastrous Livonian War in 1558. This conflict, which lasted 25 years, drained Russia's resources and led to massive casualties, all because Ivan couldn't distinguish between real and imagined threats. November 16, 1581. In the Alexander Palace, father and son faced each other across a room that had witnessed countless family arguments. But this would be different. This would be final. Ivan Ivanovich, now 27 years old, had finally found the courage to confront his father about the endless war in Livonia, the suffering of the Russian people, and the climate of fear that had engulfed the court. He accused Ivan of destroying Russia through his paranoid policies and brutal repressions. For Ivan the Terrible, this wasn't just criticism, it was the ultimate betrayal. His own son, his chosen heir, was questioning his judgment, his methods, his very right to rule as he saw fit.
The argument escalated quickly. Ivan Ivanovich accused his father of being a tyrant who had lost the right to call himself a Christian ruler. Ivan the Terrible, in response, accused his son of treason, of plotting with the boyars, of being weak and unfit to rule. And then, in a moment of uncontrolled rage that would haunt him for the rest of his life, Ivan raised his iron-pointed staff, his symbol of authority, and struck his son in the head with tremendous force. The blow was fatal. As Ivan Ivanovich collapsed, blood pooling beneath his head, Ivan the Terrible realized what he had done. He had murdered his own son, his heir, the future of the Romanov dynasty. Contemporary accounts describe Ivan falling to his knees beside his dying son, weeping and begging for forgiveness. He called for doctors, offered his entire treasury for a cure, promised to abdicate if God would only spare his child's life. But it was too late. Ivan Ivanovich died in his father's arms, and with him died the last remnant of Ivan's sanity. After his son's death, Ivan the Terrible became a broken man, but a broken man who still held absolute power over the largest empire on earth. His paranoia reached new heights, but it was now mixed with a desperate grief that made him even more unpredictable and dangerous. He began to see his dead son everywhere, in mirrors, in shadows, in the faces of courtiers who dared to look at him directly. He would have conversations with empty chairs, believing Ivan Ivanovich was sitting there, advising him on matters of state. Ivan's remaining son Fyodor was mentally disabled and clearly unfit to rule, which meant that Ivan's line would likely end with him. This realization sent the Tsar into deeper spirals of despair and rage. He began making pilgrimages to monasteries, not out of genuine repentance, but seeking magical absolution for his crimes. He consulted witches and fortune-tellers, desperate for someone to tell him that his son's death had been necessary, that his reign of terror had been justified. But perhaps most disturbing of all, Ivan began to take a perverse pride in his reputation for cruelty. Foreign ambassadors reported that he would boast about his most brutal executions, describing in detail how his victims had died while laughing at their suffering. He commissioned artists to create paintings depicting his most famous tortures, which he would display prominently in the throne room. Visiting dignitaries were forced to admire these graphic images while Ivan explained the artistic merit of various torture techniques. By 1584, Ivan's health was failing as rapidly as his mind. Years of constant stress, paranoia, and what modern doctors believe was mercury poisoning from his attempts to treat syphilis had left him a physical wreck. But even as death approached, Ivan couldn't stop seeing enemies. He became convinced that his food was being poisoned and would only eat meals prepared by a rotating group of cooks, each watched by guards who were themselves watched by other guards. He began writing his will, but kept changing it as he became convinced that various potential heirs were plotting against him. At one point, he considered leaving the entire Russian Empire to England's Queen Elizabeth II, believing that only a foreign ruler could be trusted not to betray him. On March 18, 1584, Ivan was preparing for a game of chess when he suddenly collapsed. Some accounts suggest he died of a stroke brought on by his excitement over finally achieving checkmate in a particularly difficult game, a final irony for a man who had spent his life believing everyone was plotting against him. Others claim he was finally poisoned by boyars who could no longer tolerate his rule. But given Ivan's paranoid precautions, this seems unlikely. Most probably even the Terrible died as he had lived, consumed by his own inner demons, his body finally giving out under the weight of decades of stress, paranoia, and uncontrolled rage. When news of Ivan's death spread throughout Russia, the reaction was complex and revealing. In Moscow, many people wept, not from grief but from relief that the nightmare was finally over. Church bells rang throughout the city, officially to mourn the Tsar's passing, but many heard them as bells of liberation. Yet there were also those who mourned genuinely. Despite his cruelty, Ivan had expanded Russia's territory significantly, established trade relations with Western Europe, and created the first Russian parliament, the Zemsky Sobor. His supporters argued that his harsh methods had been necessary to forge a strong, unified Russian state from the chaos of competing noble factions. But the true cost of Ivan's reign was becoming clear. Russia's population had decreased by an estimated 25% during his rule. Entire regions had been depopulated through war, execution, and famine. The economy was in ruins, drained by constant military campaigns and the expense of maintaining the oprichnina. Perhaps most damaging of all, Ivan had created a culture of fear and suspicion that would poison Russian politics for generations. His use of secret police, mass executions, and state terror as tools of governance would become a recurring theme in Russian history, echoing through the reigns of Stalin and other brutal dictators. So what are we to make of Ivan the Terrible? Was he a brilliant ruler driven to madness by circumstance, or a psychopathic monster who used power to indulge his sadistic impulses? Modern psychologists who have studied Ivan's life suggest he displayed clear symptoms of what we would now recognize as severe mental illness. His childhood trauma, combined with the immense pressure of ruling a vast empire, likely triggered conditions including paranoid personality disorder, bipolar disorder, and possibly even schizophrenia. But mental illness alone cannot excuse the magnitude of Ivan's cruelty. Plenty of rulers throughout history have suffered from psychological problems without resorting to systematic torture and mass murder. Perhaps the real lesson of Ivan the Terrible is about the corrupting nature of absolute power itself. Lord Acton's famous observation that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely seems tailor-made for Ivan's story. When any individual holds the power of life and death over millions, when they can indulge any impulse without consequence, when they are surrounded by people who dare not contradict them, the temptation to view other human beings as merely tools for their personal use becomes overwhelming. Ivan started as a traumatized child who had witnessed terrible cruelty, but instead of learning compassion from his suffering, he learned that cruelty was an effective tool for maintaining control. And once he began using that tool, it became easier and easier to justify increasingly brutal actions. The boyars who humiliated him as a child created a monster, but Ivan chose to become one. Today, more than 400 years after his death, Ivan the Terrible remains one of history's most fascinating and terrifying figures. His story has inspired countless books, films, and operas, each attempting to understand how a human being could become capable of such systematic cruelty. In Russia, Ivan's legacy is still debated. Some view him as a necessary tyrant who forged a strong nation from medieval chaos. Others see him as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of protecting human rights even during times of national crisis. But perhaps Ivan's most important legacy is the questions his life raises about human nature itself. How thin is the line between civilization and barbarism? What happens when we give any individual unlimited power over their fellow human beings? And most disturbing of all, could any of us, given the right circumstances and the wrong choices, become monsters like Ivan the Terrible? These are uncomfortable questions, but they're questions we must continue to ask. Because as long as human beings hold power over other human beings, as long as we create systems that can elevate individuals above accountability and consequence, the potential for another Ivan the Terrible exists. His reign of fear ended with his death, but the lessons of his life, about power, paranoia, and the fragility of human decency, remain as relevant today as they were 4 centuries ago. The mad Tsar is gone, but his shadow still falls across history, reminding us that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance against those who would use fear as a tool of control. And that's a story that deserves to be remembered, studied, and shared. If you found this deep dive into one of history's darkest figures as compelling as I did, make sure you're subscribed to this channel because we have so many more incredible historical stories to explore together. Hit that notification bell and I'll see you in the next video where we'll uncover another shocking tale from humanity's past that you absolutely won't believe. Tell us which country or city you're watching from. See you in the next video. Bye.